Dobby's reward. For a moment there was silence, as Harry, Ron, and Ginny and Lockhart stood at the doorway covered in muck and slime, and in Harry's case, blood. Then there was a scream, "Ginny!" It was Mrs. Weasley, who had been sitting crying in front of the fire. She leapt up to her feet, closely followed by Mr. Weasley, and both of them flung themselves around on their daughter. Harry, however, was looking past them. Professor Dumbledore was standing in the mantelpiece, beaming, next to Professor McGonagall, who was taking great steady gasps, clutching her chest. Fawkes went whooshing past Harry's ear and settled on Dumbledore's shoulder, just as Harry found himself on Ron, being swept up into Mr. and Mrs. Weasley's tight embrace. "You saved her! You saved her! How did you save her? How did you do it?" "I think we'd all like to know that," said Professor McGonagall weakly. Mrs. Weasley let go of Harry, who hesitated for a moment, then walked over to the desk, laid upon it the sorting hat and the ruby-encrusted sword, and what remained of Riddle's diary. Then he started telling them everything. For nearly a quarter of an hour he spoke into rapt silence. He told them about hearing the disembodied voices and how Hermione had finally realized that he was hearing obelisks and the pipes. Now he and Ron had followed the spiders into the forest, and Aragog had told them where the last victim of the basilisks had died. Now he had guessed that Moaning Myrtle had been the victim, and that was the entrance of the Chamber of the Secrets. Might be in the bathroom. "Very well," said Professor McGonagall, prompted him as he paused. "So you found out where the entrance was, breaking 100 school rules into pieces along the way, my dad. How on earth did you get out of there alive, Potter?" So Harry, his voice now growing hoarse from all the talking, told them about Fawkes' timely arrival, about the sorting hat giving him the sword. But then he faltered. He had so far avoided mentioning Riddle's diary, or Ginny. She was standing there with her head against Mr. Weasley's shoulder, and tears were still coursing silently down her cheeks. What if they expelled her? Harry thought, in panic. Riddle's diary didn't work any more. How could they prove that it had been he who made her do it all? Instinctively, Harry looked at Dumbledore, who smiled faintly, the fireplace glancing off his half-moon spectacles. "What interests me most," said Dumbledore gently, "is how Lord Voldemort managed to enchant Ginny, when all my sources tell me he is currently hiding in the forests of Albania." Relief, warm, sweeping, glorious relief swept over Harry. "Well, what's that?" said Mr. Weasley in a stunned voice. "You know who enchanted Ginny? But Ginny hasn't been, has she?" "It was the diary," said Harry quickly, picking up on showing it to Dumbledore. "Riddle wrote in here when he was 16. Dumbledore took the diary from Harry and peered keenly down his long, crooked nose at the burnt and soggy pages. "Brilliant," he said softly. "Of course. He was probably the most brilliant student Hogwarts ever had seen." He turned around to the Weasleys, who were looking at him utterly bewildered. "Very few people know that Lord Voldemort was once called Tom Riddle. I taught him myself 50 years ago at Hogwarts. He disappeared after leaving the school, traveled far and wide, sank in so deeply into the dark arts, consorted with the very worst of our kind, and underwent so many dangerous magical transformations that he has resurfaced as Lord Voldemort. He was barely recognizable. Hardly anyone connected Lord Voldemort with the clever, handsome boy who once was a head boy here." "But Ginny," said Mrs. Weasley, "what's our Ginny got to do with him?" "His diary," Ginny sobbed. "I've been writing in it, and he's been writing back all year." "Ginny," said Mr. Weasley, flabbergasted, "haven't I taught you anything? What have I always told you? Never trust anything that you can't think for yourself. If you can't see where it keeps its brain, why didn't you show the diary to me or your mother? A suspicious object like that is clearly full of dark magic. I didn't know, sobbed Jenny. I found it inside one of the books Mom got me. I thought someone had just left it in there and forgotten about it. Miss Weasley should go up to the hospital wing right away, Dumbledore interrupted the firm voice. This has been a terrible ordeal for her. There will be no punishment. Older and wiser wizards than you, or than she, has been hoodwinked by Lord Voldemort. He strode over the door and opened it. Bed rest? Perhaps a large or steaming mug of hot chocolate. I always find that cheers me up, he said, adding, winking kindly down at her. You will find that Madame Pomfrey is still awake. She's just giving them out mandrake juice. Victims will be waking up at any moment. So Hermione's okay? Ron said brightly. Oh, there has been no lasting harm done, Ginny, said Dumbledore. Mrs. Weasley led Ginny out, and Mr. Weasley followed, still looking deeply shaken. You know, Minerva, said Dumbledore, thoughtfully to Professor McGonagall, I think this all merits a good feast. Might I ask you to go to a Earthly kitchen? Right, said Professor McGonagall crisply, and moving to the door. I shall leave you to deal with Potter and Weasley, shall I? Certainly, said Dumbledore. She left Harry and Ron gazed uncertainly at Dumbledore. What exactly had Professor McGonagall meant by deal with them? Surely, they weren't going to be punished. Oh, I seem to remember telling you both that I would have to expel you if you broke any more school rules, said Dumbledore. Ron opened his mouth in horror. Which goes to show you the best of us must sometimes eat our words, Dumbledore went on, smiling. You will get special awards for service to our school. And let me see, oh yes, I think 200 points apiece for Gryffindor. Ron went on, highly pink, and Lockhart's Valentine flowers closed his mouth again. But one of us seems to be keeping mightily quiet about his part of the dangerous adventure, Dumbledore added. Why so modest, Gilderoy? Harry gave a start. He had completely forgotten that Lockhart had turned and saw Lockhart was standing in the corner in the room wearing a vague smile. When Dumbledore addressed him, Lockhart looked over at his shoulder to see who he was talking to. Professor Dumbledore, Ron said quickly. There was an accident down in the Chamber of Secrets, Professor Lockhart. Am I a professor? Said Lockhart mid-surprise. Goodness, I expect I was hopeless, was I? He tried to do a memory charm, and the wand backfired, Ron explained quietly to Dumbledore. Oh, dear me, said Dumbledore, shaking his head, his long silver mustache quivering. Impaled by your own sword, Gilderoy. Sword? Said Lockhart dimly. Haven't it got a sword? That boy has, though. He pointed at Harry. He'll lend you one. Would you mind taking Professor Lockhart to the infirmary, too? Dumbledore said to Ron. I'd like a few more words with Harry. Lockhart ambled out, and Ron cast a curious look back at Dumbledore and Harry as he closed the door. Dumbledore crossed to one of the chairs by the fire. Sit down, Harry, he said, and Harry sat, feeling unaccountably nervous. First of all, Harry, I want to thank you, said Dumbledore, his eyes twinkling again. You must have shown me real loyalty down in that chamber. Nothing else could have brought Fawkes to you. He stroked the phoenix, which had fluttered down onto his knee. Harry grinned awkwardly as Dumbledore watched him. And so you met Tom Riddle? Dumbledore said thoughtfully. I imagine he was most interested in you. Suddenly something that was nagging at Harry, tumbling out of his mouth. Professor Dumbledore, Riddle said I'm like him. Strange likeness, he said. Did he now? Said Dumbledore, looking thoughtfully at Harry from under his thick silver eyebrows. And what do you think, Harry? I don't think I'm like him, said Harry more loudly than he'd intended. I mean, I'm a Gryffindor. But he fell silent, a lurking doubt resurfacing in his mind. Professor, He started again after a moment. The Sorting Hat told me I'd done well in Slytherin, and everybody thought I was Slytherin heir for a while because I can speak Parseltongue. You can speak Parseltongue, Harry, said Dumbledore calmly, because Lord Voldemort, who is the last remaining descendant of Salazar Slytherin, can speak Parseltongue. Unless I am much mistaken, he transferred some of his own powers to you the night he gave you that scar. Not something he intended to do, I'm sure. Voldemort put a bit of himself in me? Harry said, thunderstruck. It certainly seems so. So I should be in Slytherin, Harry said, looking desperately at Dumbledore's face. The Sorting Hat could see Slytherin power in me, and it put you in Gryffindor, said Dumbledore calmly. Listen to me, Harry. You happen to have many qualities Salazar Slytherin prized in his hand-picked students. His own very rare gift to Parseltongue, resourcefulness, determination, a certain disregard for the rules, he added, his moustache quivering again. Yet the Sorting Hat had placed you in Gryffindor. You know why I think why that was? Think. It only put me in Gryffindor, said Harry, in a defeated voice, because I asked it not to put me in Slytherin. Exactly, said Dumbledore, beaming once more, which makes you very different from Tom Riddle. It is our choices, Harry, that show us who we truly are. But more than our abilities. Harry sat motionless in his chair, stunned. If you want proof, Harry, you belonging to Gryffindor, I suggest you look more closely at this. Dumbledore reached across to Professor McGonagall's desk and picked up the blood-stained silver sword that handed it to Harry. Dully, Harry turned it over, and the rubies blazing in the firelight, and there he saw the name engraved just below the hilt. Godric Gryffindor. Only a true Gryffindor could have pulled that out of the hat, Harry, said Dumbledore simply. For a minute, neither of them spoke. Then when Dumbledore pulled out one of the drawers of Professor McGonagall's desk and took out a quill and a bottle of ink. What you need, Harry, is some food and some sleep. I suggest you go down to the feast while I write to Azkaban. We need our gamekeeper back, and I must draft an advertisement for the Daily Prophet, too, he said thoughtfully. We will be needing a new defense against dark arts, teacher. Dear me, we do seem to go through them, don't we? Harry got up and crossed to the door. He had just reached the handle, however, when the door burst open violently, and he bounced off the wall. Lucius Malfoy stood there, fury in his face. Cowering behind his legs, heavily wrapped in bandages, was Dobby. Good evening, Lucius, said Professor Dumbledore pleasantly. Mr. Malfoy almost knocked Harry over as he swept into the room. The elf was carrying a stained rag, which was attempting to finish cleaning Mr. Malfoy's shoes. Apparently Mr. Malfoy had set out in great hurry, for not only were his shoes half polished, but his usually sleek hair was disheveled. Ignoring the elf bowing apologetically around his ankles, he fixed his cold eyes on Dumbledore. So, he said, you've come back. The governor suspended you, but you will still saw fit to return to Hogwarts? Well, you see, Lucius, said Dumbledore, smiling serenely, the other 11 governors contacted me today. It was something like being caught in a hailstorm of owls, to tell you the truth. They'd heard that Arthur Weasley's daughter had been killed and wanted me back there at once. They seemed to think that I was the best man for the job after all. Very strange tales they told me, too. Several of them seemed to think that you had threatened to curse their families if they didn't agree to suspend me in the first place. Mr. Malfoy went even paler than usual, but his eyes were still slits of fury. So, have you stopped the attacks yet? He sneered. Have you caught the culprit? We have, said Dumbledore with a smile. Well, said Mr. Malfoy sharply, who is it? The same person as last time, Lucius, said Dumbledore, but this time Lord Voldemort was acting through somebody else, by means of his diary. He held up the small black book with a large hole through the center. Watching Mr. Malfoy closely, Harry, however, was watching Dobby. The elf was doing something very odd. His great eyes fixed meaningfully on Harry, and he kept pointing to the diary and then to Mr. Malfoy, and then hitting himself in the head with a fist. "I see," said Mr. Malfoy slowly to Dumbledore. "A clever plan," said Dumbledore in a level voice, still staring Mr. Malfoy straight in the eye. "Because if Harry here," Mr. Malfoy shot Harry a swift, sharp look, "and his friend Ron hadn't discovered this book, why, Ginny Weasley might have taken all the blame. No one would ever know and be able to prove that it hadn't acted on her own free will." Mr. Malfoy said nothing. His face suddenly turned mask-like. "And imagine," Dumbledore went on, "what might have happened then. The Weasleys are one of the most prominent pure-blood families. Imagine the effect on Arthur Weasley in the Muggle Protection Act, and his own daughter was discovered attacked and killed. Muggleborns. Very fortunate the diary was discovered and Riddle's memories wiped from it. Who knows what the consequences might have been otherwise?" Malfoy forced himself to speak. "Very fortunate," he said stiffly. And still behind his back, Dobby was pointing first to the diary and then to Lucius, and then pointing to himself and hitting himself in the head. And Harry suddenly understood. He nodded to Dobby, and Dobby, back in the corner, twisted his ears of parchment. "Don't you want to know how Ginny got a hold of that diary, Mr. Malfoy?" said Harry. Lucius Malfoy rounded on him. "How should I know that stupid little girl got a hold of it?" he said. "Because you gave it to her," said Harry, in a flourish and blotch. "You picked up the old Transfiguration book and you slipped it in the diary inside it, didn't you?" He saw Mr. Malfoy's white hands clench and unclench. "Prove it," he hissed. "Oh, no. No one will be able to do that," said Dumbledore, smiling at Harry. "Not now that Riddle has vanished from the book. On the other hand, I would advise you, Lucius, not to give out any more of Lord Voldemort's old school things. If any more of them should find their way into innocents' hand, I think Arthur Weasley, for one, will make sure they are traced back to you." Lucius Malfoy stood for a moment, and Harry distinctly saw his right hand twitch as though he was longing to reach for his wand. Instead, he turned on his house elf. "We're going, Dobby." He wrenched the door open, and the elf came hurrying up to him and kicked him right through it. He pointed, and you could hear Dobby squealing with pain all the way down the corridor. Harry stood for a moment thinking hard. Then it came to him. "Professor Dumbledore," he said hurriedly, "can I have that diary back to Mr. Malfoy, please?" "Certainly, Harry," said Dumbledore calmly. "But hurry. The feast, remember." Harry grabbed the diary and dashed out of the office. He could hear Dobby's squeals of pain receding around the corner. Quickly, wondering if the plan could possibly work, Harry took off one of his shoes and pulled the slimy, filthy sock that had stuffed in the diary into it. Then he ran down the corridor, caught up with them at the top of the stairs. "Mr. Malfoy," he gasped, skidding to a halt. "I got something for you." He forced the smelly sock into Lucius Malfoy. "What's the—" Mr. Malfoy ripped the sock off the dirty and threw it aside, then looked furiously from the ruined book to Harry. "You meet the same sticky end as your parents one of these days, Harry Potter," he said softly. "They will meddlesome fools, too." He turned to go. "Come, Dobby." I said come. But Dobby didn't move. He was holding up Harry's disgusting slimy sock, as though it were a priceless treasure. "Master has given me a sock," said the elf in wonderment. "Master gave it to Dobby." "What's that?" spat Mr. Malfoy. "What did you say?" "Got a sock," said Dobby in disbelief. "Master threw it, and Dobby caught it, and Dobby's free." Lucius Malfoy stood frozen, staring at the elf. Then he lunged at Harry. "You've lost me my servant, boy!" But Dobby shouted, "You shall not harm Harry Potter." There was a loud bang, and Mr. Malfoy was thrown backward. He crashed down the stairs, at a time, landing in a crumpled heap on the landing below. He got up, his face livid, and pulled out his wand, but Dobby raised a long, threatening finger. "You shall go now," he said fiercely, pointing down at Mr. Malfoy. "You shall not touch Harry Potter. You shall go now." Lucius Malfoy had no choice. With the last incensed stare at the pair of them, he swung his cloak around him and hurried out of sight. "Harry Potter for Dobby!" said the elf shrilly, gazing up at Harry in the moonlight, and the nearest window reflected in the orb-like eyes. "Harry Potter set Dobby free!" "Least I could do, Dobby," Harry said, grinning. "Just promise never to try to save my life again." The elf's ugly brown face lit up suddenly into a wide, toothy smile. "Oh, I've just got one question, Dobby," said Harry, and Dobby pulled the sock back in his shaking hand. "You told me all this had nothing to do with he who must be named. Remember?" "Well?" "It was a clue, sir," said Dobby, his eyes widening as though this was obvious. "He was giving you a clue. The Dark Lord, before he changed his name, could be freely named, you see." "Right," said Harry weakly. "Well, I'd better go. There's a feast. My friend Hermione should be awake by now." Dobby threw his arms around Harry's middle and hugged him. "Harry Potter is far greater than Dobby knew," he sobbed. "Farewell, Harry Potter." And with that, a final crack, Dobby disappeared. Harry had been several Hogwarts feasts, but never one quite like this one. Everybody was in their pajamas and celebrating last all night. Harry didn't know whether the bit was Hermione running towards him and screaming, "You solved it! You solved it!" or Justin hurrying over to the Hufflepuff table, writing his hand and apologizing endlessly for suspecting him, or Hagrid turning up 3:30, cuffing Harry and Ron so hard that on the shoulders they were knocked into their plates of trifle, or his and Ron's 400 points for Gryffindor score securing the House Cup for a second year running, or Professor McGonagall standing up to tell them that their exams had been cancelled and the school as a school treat. "Oh no," said Hermione. Or Dumbledore announcing that, fortunately, Professor Lockhart would be unable to return next year, owing the fact that he needed to go away to get some of his memory back. Quite a few of the teachers joined in cheering with that news. "Shame," said Ronald, helping himself to a jam donut. "He was starting to grow on me." The rest of the final term passed in the haze of blazing sunshine. Hogwarts was back to normal, with only a few small differences. Events against our classes were cancelled, but we've had plenty of practice in that anyways, Ron told disgruntled Hermione. And Lucius Malfoy had been sacked as the school governor. Draco was no longer strutting around the school as though he owned the place. On the contrary, he looked resentful and sulky. On the other hand, Ginny Weasley was perfectly happy again. Too soon, it was time for them to journey home the Hogwarts Express. Harry, Ron, and Hermione, Fred and George and Ginny got in the compartments and to themselves. They most had the last few hours in which they were allowed to do magic before the holidays. They played Exploding Snap and setting off the last Fred and George's filibuster fireworks and practiced disarming each other by magic. Harry was getting very good at it. This was where the King's Cross, and Harry remembered something. "Ginny, what did you see Percy doing that he didn't want anyone to tell?" "Oh, that," Ginny giggling. "Well, Percy's got a girlfriend." Fred dropped a stack of books on George's head. "What?" "Yeah, it's that Ravenclaw prefect, Penelope Clearwater," said Ginny. "That's who he was writing to all last summer. He's been meeting her all over the school in secret. I walked in on them kissing in an empty classroom one day. He was so upset that she was, attacked. You won't tease him, will you?" she added anxiously. "Oh, wouldn't dream of it," said George, who was looking like this birthday had come early. "Definitely not," said George, sniggering. The Hogwarts Express slowed and finally stopped. Harry pulled out a quill and a bit of parchment and turned to Ron and Hermione. "This is called a telephone number. he told Ron, scribbling it twice, tearing the parchment in two, handing it to them. I told your dad how to use a telephone last summer. He'll know. Call me at the Dursleys, okay? I can't stand another 2 months with only Dudley to talk to. Your aunt and uncle will be proud, won't they? Said Hermione when they got to the train and joined the crowd of thronging towards the enchanted barrier. When they hear what you did this year? Proud? Said Harry. Are you crazy? Oh, the times I could have died and didn't manage it? They'll be furious. Together they walked through and back to the gateway to the Muggle world.